Welcome to today's webinar, Don't Fear Bid Season, Understanding the Shipper, Broker, Carrier Continuum, sponsored by Trimble. I'm Chris Wolski with Heavy Duty Trucking, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. However, if we don't get to yours, don't worry. You will be contacted via email with a response after the event. Today, Trimble has also provided a resource that is available for download. You can access this resource on the left-hand side of the player in the Event Resources tab located under the Q&A text field. Our presenter, Peter Komandoros, will provide more information about this download during the presentation. With that being said, our presenters today are Peter Komandoros, General Manager with QVIX Load Match Group, and Trimble, Scott Minton, Product Manager, also with Trimble, and Stephanie Williamson, VP of Revenue Management with the Dart Transit Company. Peter's team manages the rapidly growing QVIX Load Match Group, also known as KLMG, which connects shippers and community carriers for their spot quote and RFP needs. Peter has 30 years of extensive experience and a deep understanding of truckload asset-based carrier operations, as well as 3PL, brokerage, less than truckload, and expedited. Scott's trucking career started in 1991 on the loading docks, and he moved on to 10 years in trucking operations and 7 years in pricing and network design. He's now been with Trimble for 5 years as a significant contributor to projects such as Market Insights, which are intended to transform the way trucking works. Stephanie's career in transportation began in the driver's seat and has taken her all the way to the executive suite. She has held various positions in the industry in recruiting, operations, safety, and pricing. She came to Dart Transit Company in 1994 and worked her way through operations, brokerage, and pricing. Her passion for pricing, network design, and analytics has propelled her through the ranks to her current position of Vice President, Revenue Management. Stephanie is a member of the Dart executive team and is active in her local community. So without further ado, I'll hand over the reins to Peter. Peter, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it, and welcome, everybody. A couple of takeaways from today that you can take away is that the bid season is something that needs to be prepared for much sooner than later, especially given this year's capacity crunch and opportunities out there. A season to really look at it from a much different perspective. We'll talk today about how to create a playbook to guide the bidding process, as well as determining your strengths as a carrier to target new potential and repeat shippers. The process is really a means to starting and building a collaborative relationship with your shippers and brokers, whether it's a new relationship or expanding a current relationship. Stephanie?
All right, so now is the time to begin preparing. Bid season typically starts in October. It may or may not be a coincidence that it runs around the same time as flu season, so that would be through the first quarter. It feels much more like a year-round activity these days. And some of our bigger shippers, and your bigger shippers too out there, is they run multiple events during the year. And some shippers have such dynamic and fluid vendor networks that they are running bids weekly. So seasonal commodities cause bid changes, and we've had significant problems and changes that are addressed through bids this year because of our pandemic situation and supply chain disruption. Resource-like carriers may not have as much opportunity to invest in tech, which automates some of that for those of us who do have those resources. So that makes it challenging to respond in these short turnaround times. And there are more than 777,000 for-hire carriers competing for $740 billion in freight spend. We're a highly fragmented industry, and we're all kind of jockeying for our own position there. So I would say that the contract bid season begins in earnest in January, but it's never too early to begin planning. Pete?
Thank you, Stephanie. The big part of the planning process really begins with the shippers, and the shippers really are putting a lot more this year into their RFPs. And the biggest part really is articulating what their goal is. Their goal to save money? Is their goal to expand the carrier base, reduce the carrier base, focus on lanes having service issues? And that is really what I think a carrier should focus on coming into it, is what the goal of the RFP is. Some of the shipper preparation is, what are their specific lanes that they're looking to put out there? Is it one lane? Is it multiple lanes? Is it strictly one DC? Is it a regional, or is it a full network RFP? Again, from the shipper, understanding the carrier base, understanding, what the data looks like from the carrier's historical, or if they have historical information about them, such as their tender accept and rejection rates, their on-time performance, how many lanes an incumbent is currently handling. Is that incumbent a majority, a minority of the volume in a certain lane? And really looking at that list from a data perspective and deciding from the carrier list who will be coming in for the incumbent list into the next year's RFP, who would be invited. There may be some you not wish to invite back for performance reasons. You might be looking at certain quality issues like equipment, drivers, other metrics such as their DOT basics. Maybe some of the reasons they've had service issues over the past year. Have there been more mechanicals? Have there been issues driver-related? Again, this is all part of that process of looking at your carrier base from a shipper's perspective to articulate what you're looking for, and saying also to your salespeople in your company, okay, where do we have new potential customers next year? Where we're going to need additional carrier support in lanes we don't currently have coverage on with our carrier base today, to make that part of the RFP. All these things help a shipper to be able to articulate to the carriers what they're looking for, and allow the carrier to have a better understanding of those shippers' needs and be able to offer pricing or strategic or synergistic fits when they start to put their bids in. Stephanie?
Yeah, the one thing that, and I've spoken with my analysts extensively about this, about their biggest challenge during processing of a large-scale bid, or sometimes even a small-scale bid, is we all have had the multiple round bid, and we expect that information could change slightly between rounds. The one desire, our wish list item, is for shippers to not change their lane identification between rounds, so that we can pinpoint what's new in the subsequent rounds of a bid. And if a lane is going to go away, just zero it out and put a note for us and kind of leave it in play so we can compare the two rounds and know what's different. That's pretty critical for us. What do you think about that, Scott?
Oh, I agree with respect to the planning on the carrier side. The next slide, Jim. Really where I first went in my mind when, say, Pete as a shipper would send out the RFP, the request for proposal. I know that in the end, the centerpiece is oftentimes what are your rates at the lane level and capacity commitments. But I found it really useful to first understand the contract itself that's found within the RFP. And it was useful in large part because those rules of engagement found in the contract can easily affect lane level price. So, for example, the payment terms can make a big difference if the carrier is being paid in, say, 20 days, 30 days, or 120 days. And that's found in the contract fuel surcharge table, of course. The carrier will have an expectation of how much fuel they need, for the lane by lane, and it could be the shipper's fuel surcharge payment is different than that, either favorable or not favorable. You'll find also in there perhaps a requirement for trailer age. I remember that certainly with hauling rolls of paper. Power detention, trailer detention. So really, I first went to the contract to understand those rules of engagement and interpret from that in what way my line haul rates may or may not be adjusted. But yes, right away, I would go to the lane file. So in the lane file, I was looking for things, as much information as I could get about the operating characteristics was really helpful when determining price. I'm sure you guys know this, but drop and hook is oftentimes more attractive than live. Sometimes the live appointments are at 2 a.m, and that also can impact rate at the lane level. So I always had a strong appetite for the bits and pieces that I could get from the lane file that helped me sort of forecast what the driver experience would be like. Also, I zoomed in on the lane format. A lot of these larger bids, the files will have point-to-point lane rates, and typically that's where your lane volume is found, but then you'll find 3-to-3, point to region, all of those different combinations. So the way the lane file itself was laid out, looking for the lane volume and the point-to-point lanes, really was important because that did inform us in the way that we would approach the pricing itself. And then having kind of pawed through the documents in that way, I would just broadly think about the operating network where I was operating. So I would think of it in terms of territory. Where is it do I want to operate, and with whom? So the shipper and the kind of the nature of the shipper made a difference, and it was something to think about. And the way I went about that is with respect to thoughts on territory or where to operate, I was kind of thinking like an economist in a way. Principles like supply and demand. So in our lingo, the head haul markets versus the back haul markets is pretty much a function of supply and demand. Even economy of scale. So how big is my fleet? How big are the areas where I operate? Because there are some benefits, just like in economics, just derived from the size. A little bit of economy of scope even, and to me that was with respect to shippers, did I have a variety or diversification among my shippers and the type of business that they had? Similarly, like at the area level, did I have good volume in, say, the Atlanta area, but did I depend on only 1 or 2 shippers? And therefore, I was assuming some risk. If I lost that business, what do I do? How do I respond? When I thought about the shipper, I'd say sort of similar to thinking like an economist. You think a little bit like an investor. In some ways, I thought about those shippers that I had arrangements with, was doing business with, was a little bit like how an investor builds a portfolio of, say, stocks. So the business that they're in made a difference to me. For example, are they, CPG, consumer packaged goods? I had thoughts about whether I liked that or not. Building materials, beverage. Each of these industries has characteristics to it. So I wanted to think it through. What is that diversity or mix among the shippers? So broadly, that's how I kind of was thinking about stuff before we got down to digging into what the rates ought to be. That takes us to the next slide where I see get plugged into external sources of economic data. So that one was especially interesting to me. I've always found trucking fascinating in large part because of the way it's considered a leading economic indicator. So I would stay in tune and found it helpful with RFPs to these broad economic measurements, even just GDP. Is the economy expanding or not? Is it expanding fast or not? Inventory to sales ratio. What are the interest rates doing? And it would be informative. So I want it to be plugged into those sources of data. The usefulness of it, just one quick example, I suppose, would be if I felt like interest rates were about to go way up, maybe I would surmise that building activity would go down. So if I was reliant on building materials, perhaps I would think about kind of right-sizing or rationalizing my reliance on that. So I did find that just being plugged into the economy as we were going about trucking did make a difference. With respect to the calendar of activities, that first item, to me, it's really a statement on organization. Bid season is, it can be a whirlwind, and I certainly had my moments where I feared it, because you'll have RFPs from multiple shippers coming in kind of at the same time, as Stephanie had mentioned, and there can be multiple rounds of pricing, as Stephanie had mentioned. So keeping up with due dates, so those tight turnaround times that can happen, that has to be organized. And the primary purpose really for me was I wanted to make sure that my internal due date was a day or two or three before the external shipper due date, so that the team and the management could take a look at the rates, because in those rates you find your overall network strategy. So just keeping up with due dates was no small task, worth the effort to stay organized. And then, of course, the multiple rounds. Sometimes, Stephanie, I wasn't sure exactly if there even would be a next round. So you have to stay on your toes and be able to respond when, say, round two does show back up. It's really, there is a lot of emphasis to not just make it through the RFPs and bid season, but to really thrive. A lot of that does depend on organization. And the next slide, Jen, I wanted to kind of get Stephanie brought back in here. It's been, 5 years since I was in the middle of it all myself. But I wanted to hear from Stephanie more specifically about your team. What did your pricing team, your analyst team look like? And then a lot of really the specifics of those things that you looked at in your network that you felt like you could improve upon or find efficiencies, that kind of thing, and maybe some network optimization concepts that you had.
Sure. So, the whole network design concept makes approaching the bid very streamlined, actually, because, when we came into designing our network, we had over 2,000 origin-destination pairs, and that was that spread is very thin. So when you have that many origin-destination pairs, and I'm not talking city to city, I'm talking area to area, so that's a lot, right? So your equipment's kind of all over the place, your capacity's all over the place, you can't respond quickly to anything, and you really don't have the density in a market to be of value for a shipper that you may covet. And by covet, I mean someone you just want to do business with. Their business is perfect for you. You're perfect for them. It'll be a marriage made in heaven, right? But you're not important enough in that market to be there for them. So what we did was we took our existing network and we condensed that down to things that made sense for us so we could be better for the people we chose to do business with and that chose to do business with us. So in 12 months, we took that, I think it was 2174 actually was the OD pair footprint, and we took it down to about 800. And that really eliminated a lot of noise in our network and let us decide who we want to be when we grow up and focus on that. Focus is an incredible thing. You improve everything once you focus, right? So it let us focus in operations. It let us have more focus in maintenance. It let us have more focus in safety. And because of that network, I was able to reduce my team to half. I can process the same number of bids per week with half of the team because we know who we are, where we're going, and we have automation to help us. So we're processing 40 to 50 bids per week with 4 people.
Yeah. So when I hear you, how you guys collapsed your capacity into fewer OD pairs, to me that's density, right? You would call that density. What other types of stuff did you?
I would call that density in our network, but it's density in your network is not to say don't be diverse in who's in that network.
Yeah. Right.
That insulates you from a lot of problems. Seasonality with shippers, financial distress with shippers. I hate it when that happens, but it does happen. It insulates you from a lot of things. So be dense in your network and diverse in your shipper base within that network.
And I bet you guys take a hard look at empty miles and ways to improve empty miles.
We do. In fact, that improved our empty miles. We measure empty miles 2 ways, and I know that historically the industry standard is to look at a percentage of deadhead. We like to look at it that way so we can benchmark against other carriers, but also we like to look at what are the average empty miles per dispatch. Just because a load has a longer length of haul, in my mind, doesn't mean you should get to add more waste to it. So that really focuses you in, zeroes you in on loading a truck where it lands. If everybody in your organization knows that we want you ideally to go no further than 54 miles to get to your next load. That's different than 10% or 12%. If it's a 1,000-mile load, you can go 100 miles. That doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, that 100 miles is a lot of time. I always thought about the number of miles. I'd convert that to the number of minutes,
Right.
Well, yeah. And then balance. So when you collapse your operating territory like you guys did, how do you go about keeping up with the balance between inbound and outbound on these various areas?
Well, when you have less places to count, it's easier to keep the count and to be cognizant of the count. So, we obviously, like everybody has some sort of tool to know how many trucks are landing somewhere and when they're coming and how many loads you need to book to be balanced and get out. But balance is as much affected by your ability to book freight consistently as it is empty miles and time. So if you know that you only go to certain places, your trucks are never like out of their traffic lane, out of their power lane for more than they should be, and that improves your ability to manage balance. Network design is critical to this whole equation. So for us, balance and density were the keys.
One of the things that I think that Trimble does so well, really focused in on how transportation works, is grabbing all of these key pieces of operating data and keep creating a repository, a data warehouse, where I know for me one of the key components that I looked at also was just a simple calculation from the operating data of velocity. So velocity for me was pretty much L to A, loaded call to arrival call, I was always evaluating how quickly in behalf of the driver, so how efficiently is the driver able to get from point A to point B, as well as what is the velocity of the revenue. Do you guys look pretty closely at the different types of velocity measurements?
We do, and we critically review every aspect of time and the root cause of what causes the time to be out of variance. So in transit time, dwell time, loading time, unloading time, whose fault is it? How can we fix it? How can we keep it from happening in the future? And that could be a driver conversation. It could be a planner conversation. It could be a customer conversation. Time is everyone's responsibility, for sure.
Right. And when those findings do need to result in a conversation with a customer about maybe trying to get better appointments or maybe converting to a drop, could be that maybe there's more freight is needed. What's so helpful is from the data you have a basis, really, something very objective and specific to rely on when having those conversations.
Sure. It's one of the easiest conversations in the world, actually, because everyone can see it on paper. So when you bring that up, and having those types of conversations with your customers, they want to be brought into your world. They want to understand your world so they can help make their own world better because of it, just like you want to understand your customers' situation as well. You want to understand each other's pain points to get through all of this together. And nothing should ever be a surprise. You should always be having conversations that when you have to make a choice and say, we need to not do this anymore, they understand because you've coached them through that and sought their guidance for resolution. And if they can't fix it, they can't fix it, but they understand why you can't continue.
Yeah, I completely agree. That collaboration, I never had trouble talking with a shipper about different ways that execution can happen better, So
right.
It's an easy conversation, and having that data really unlocks it. I wanted to mention, I heard Pete call out playbook, and that was a concept I used in my pricing network design experience. So the challenge, coming up with a playbook when I was in this was one of the more useful things that I did. And a playbook is really based on these things that we've talked about. Where do you want to operate? With whom and why? And what are those opportunities for efficiency improvement in the operating network itself? Given those findings, what was the challenge is how do you incorporate that into the pricing when the RFP shows up again? So when your pricing analyst is sitting there, is that person surrounded by these bits and pieces of information when pricing? So a playbook ended up for me being at the lane level and at the shipper, then lane level. It was kind of the conclusions that I drew from this continuous feedback loop, my pursuit for continuous improvement. So at the lane level, I could understand that I need to do basically more of this freight, this lane, less of that lane. And it's an important finding because in pricing, what I found helpful is you want to win all of the right freight, but sometimes there's some freight you just need to lose. You need to replace it with something else. So, Pete, I heard you call playbook, and it's not an easy thing because you have to draw conclusions at the shipper and at the lane level and have that incorporated in the pricing experience. And it's not so easy if you are having to price just inside of the the shipper's lane file. So part of the leaning on technology a little bit to thrive in bid season. It helps so much to have technology that can get you out of pricing in the shipper's actual lane file.
Yeah.
Boy,
to that point,
the
technology part is probably the biggest tool resource to help expedite this relationship that's beginning or continuing between a shipper and a carrier. Once the shipper has already put into their the scope of their RFP, what they want to accomplish, it still is a big task ahead of them to really buckle down with collecting the carriers they want to include, both incumbents and new carriers. It's a lot of work to pull their lanes together. They're having to have a bid tool to help is an incredible resource because now they can include more carriers or smaller carriers who would not be otherwise they'd be able to handle just from a management point of view of all those carriers. So doing it manually is a daunting task, which limits your opportunity to expand your opportunity carriers potentially. Collecting carrier demographics, contact information, getting all the lane data, sending out the RFP, receiving it back, aggregating data by lane, which lanes they did not want to participate in, which ones did they want to participate in. Maybe they had a bid on 50 of 100 annual lane truckloads in that lane. The awarding process, all that is a very complex, or can be a very complex process depending on the size of the RFP. Managing that, imagine you have 25 carriers in an RFP participation. You want to lay out the expectations to each participant just so they're able to engage and want to be part of that RFP. They want to be a transportation partner for you. That is really a critical part of this whole action plan, is working this process very comfortably so that each step falls into the next one in a natural cadence. You want carriers to be with you along the way. If the carriers that see that's not the fit, as Stephanie and Scott mentioned earlier, that's the time they should bow out and not put in something that's going to be a forced lane or a heartbreak lane when they go to award a potential from a shipper's perspective. So the next slide, please, Jen. In this slide here, being this continuous cycle, from a carrier's perspective, is again, I think Scott and Stephanie mentioned this. It's all part of really a shared responsibility to make sure that the RFP that a carrier is receiving from the shipper is understood. If there's any questions about the type of equipment, the type of service involved, the lane, any nuances to it, the shipper should let those nuances be known so the carrier can both bid on it competitively, or if one of the goals of a RFP for a shipper is we're having troubles in this lane because of unloading, we're having troubles because of the time of day, we're having troubles because of the neighborhood restrictions on trucking before 6 a.m. Let those nuances be known. There might be a carrier who has a solution to that so they can be part of the process, not just for pricing, but help you meet the needs of your clients through an RFP. And really having, from a carrier perspective, determining, again, like Stephanie mentioned, which ones fit and which ones don't fit. That's probably as critical to bidding on a good lane as knowing when to walk away from it. And then we get to the contracting side. And Scott, Stephanie, you guys had a lot of experience with this, with the contracting side?
Sure. A lot of experience with the contracting side. So I think it's really important to know, again, what your acceptance of a contract could be without much deviation. Certainly there has to be negotiation, but the one watch out I would have is don't allow yourself to be so enticed about the business that you sign off to do things that you don't really want to do. So if you have insurance limitations, and this would go, oh, just a little bit over that. Really explore how much that's going to cost you, and were you aware of that when you did that bid? Because sometimes things sneak in, after the fact. So just make sure that your contract is in line with what you thought it was going to be.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. And that brings about the whole implementing the contract side of the equation. Scott, from a carrier's perspective on implementing?
Yeah, I guess I can get this started with you guys chiming in here in a minute. But when I think about implementing the contract, I think of a few things. Number one, again, somewhat of a technology story, is to implement the contract, you have to update your systems with the new rates, with an effective date, a go-live date, and the award volume. So it's always helpful to understand not just what is the rate, but how many of each of these lanes are you expected to get. So it's no small task to update the TMS, the systems, to reflect the outcome of this bid process, which, as you guys know, could be 3-4 months long. Additionally, in many cases, there's a lot of considerations, like some business. If you lost some business, it could be that you have to go get trailers from a trailer pool. And it could certainly be that you won new business where you have to think about, how many trailers do I need based on the award volume? How do I get them there? It's for a carrier, it's, Stephanie, I bet you'd agree, but it can be a really noticeable large expense to install a trailer pool. So that does require collaboration with the shipper based on the volume and the shipper expectations, is how many trailers do they need for a trailer pool? Who's going to set the appointment? There's just lots and lots of details like that, Pete, that the carrier needs to know about. And with implementation, that's what comes to mind first for me. What do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I agree, Scott. From the shipper side, you're, in a lot of ways, people have RFPs as the beginnings of relationships, or continuations of relationships, but you hit the nail on the head. Sometimes it's the end of a relationship in an amicable way. And you mentioned, got to remove equipment from the yard. Most shippers in RFP process like this understand that it's a change of guard, let's say, of who's handling their freight, and they should actively work with that outgoing carrier, if they can, to load those trailers back with loads into that carrier's lanes as more of a thank you for the service they gave. At the same time, work with the new carriers coming in a very proactive way to not just say, you won the business, here's a tender, great. They should really have an onboarding process, a clear way of laying out the expectations of what is being awarded, agreeing the pricing that was all agreed, that was proposed, is agreeable. If there's any adjustment of anything at that point in time, any new operational nuance that came up, that's the time to make any of those adjustments before the contract is really begun. Aligning your teams. There are, someone on the RFP side may not be in the front lines for operations on the shipper side, and likely on the carrier side, that pricing department is not in the front lines in dispatch. Those two frontline parties should be the responsibility of the shipper and the carrier to come together and make sure there's a clear understanding of what the operational roles are for each one. Is the tender going to come a week before the shipment, 2 days before, day of? Will it come by email, by EDI? What is the process once it's received? Is there appointments to be made? Try to avoid any surprises that may come up. And that really, the shipper knows their client base that they're shipping to. What are the nuances on their client side? Maybe there's a customer they have that is very ticklish. They always want to have somebody back into door 5 through 6 for receiving in the morning, because that's where they do their cross-docking. That's critical information to know during that operation onboarding call for lanes being awarded. Again, minimize the surprises at all levels.
You know,
Stephanie,
though,
anything else?
I mean, for all this planning that we do during these bids, there's still going to come a time when you get the award back and you don't have those trucks. And that's a difficult conversation, but one that has to be had, because ultimately we're all service providers. And if we can't provide service, there is absolutely no reason that we should take on that burden and disappoint everybody in the process. We have to speak up and say, this, the capacity that we were bringing in is no longer available. Everybody knows everybody does bids at the same time. This churn is destructive to carriers, to shippers, within their own networks and within the complementary networks that they're not even aware of. So it's very disruptive in the supply chain for us to have all this bid churn. But I would say too, don't bid on things you can't handle just to give a bid to a valued customer. Don't if you can't handle it, speak up. It's not doing anybody any favors, and it makes them very unhappy in their solutions that they're putting together when they're evaluating these bids. So sometimes things can be very attractive on paper, but in practice, in reality, they're not that attractive. So just stay true to your goals as you're entering a bid, and that's the only ones you're going to provide, and just speak up at the award date if you don't have those trucks anymore. They won't be happy, but they'll be even less happy if you take it and can't do it.
That's a great point, Stephanie, is that the shipper doesn't want to have just all boxes checked at the completion date of the RFP. He wants to have providers who are going to be there for him. Now, that's going to leave, potentially, some network uncovered by a specific assigned contracted carriers. Spot quoting is still a very necessary component of a transportation program. A shipper doesn't want to have their entire network be volatile and be subject to spot pricing and market pricing. But it does round out a certain piece of the equation. At Cubics, we have the load match product, which aligns our shippers with our asset and intermediary providers and our community carriers. That's one way of having it. A product like that has a process of curation where we've already done some analytics about the carriers and make those warm introductions for the spot market. Those relationships, can take a carrier and a shipper from a spot to a contract lane over time. Somebody may be bidding out on the same spot lane once every 3 or 4 weeks, happen to fit their network. They may be getting it, and they're happy with the spot rate. So you know what? Just put me in there for this lane when it comes up going forward, and it can evolve that way. We're doing more Cubics than just a smart load board. We're providing these real live connections between carriers who have specific lane needs and shippers with specific needs. Our platform allows a single window to allow those relationships to begin and flourish in a digital environment. So I think from the safety perspective, spot pricing is a necessary component of it, and that is really where I think the shipper has to recognize that they're not going to have every single lane covered and expect 100% tender if they're forcing carriers to take a lane that they would not want otherwise. And I think the most successful shipper RFPs do have some component of the best selected carriers and providers in those lanes. And if there's ones on left, then we can do it with spot market pricing. Scott, anything else on continuous improvement?
Yeah, it's interesting because you think about all that we've talked about thus far. It has, in large part, been a story about continuous improvement and how when the RFP is done, the conversation between the shipper and the carrier are really ongoing. And that in itself is a means for continuous improvement. Looking at the time, I will say, Pete, that in the end of the RFP, the arrangements have been made, systems have been updated. Here's a go-live date. Trailer pools are there or not there. So from what I know from the trucker side, there's really the compliance to the contract or compliance to these arrangements really is important to both parties. Is the shipper offering the freight that's expected? And starting with the go live date. Is the carrier accepting that freight as expected by the shipper? Is service level acceptable? And can the two parties collaborate on that? That could be. That's an easy fix. From a carrier, did the operating characteristics assumed when pricing, is that what's actually happening? That was something I watched closely, and I can hear from Stephanie. She does as well. And then just generally, while I close up on this section, Pete, it's also the case, we've seen it, of course, in 2020, big time, do the shippers' transportation needs just change? You know, the RFP is based on shipper forecasts, and things can happen where those transportation needs change, and can the carrier respond to them? And it's also true that throughout the year, the carrier's network dynamics, the network needs also change. So there's just every reason for the carrier and the shipper to think about continuous improvement as a collaborative exercise. Pete?
No. Yeah, Scott, you're spot on that, that a contract, an RFP process sounds very binary and very, dodgy, but in reality, it should be more of a relationship, more of a collaboration, as you're saying, Scott, that, you want to do work for the shipper needs that carrier do that work for them. If they do it at a fair price that everybody's happy with, then there's an ongoing want to be in that relationship. Our products at the Scott, our products with Cubics and the Engage.biz allow these shippers and carriers to connect in a very seamless way. And that is allowing relationships to begin. The end goal of our platform is to allow these shipper and carrier relationships to live in one place. And, part of this is that we're an agnostic platform. We're not motivated by margin in that relationship. We're trying to bring them together in a way that meets the needs of the shippers and carriers so that they can properly and efficiently manage that relationship and have that true collaboration. I think if you look at the types of products that Trimble has for, visibility, for, the load match product, for yield, market insights for information, mobility, all these products allow the carrier to accurately figure those things out and properly price their operation for the shipper's needs in a way that allows them to collaborate in a cost-effective way. We've covered a lot of information here, a lot in the RFP process from both sides. Chris, I think there was a download that you may point us to in the end. There's a sample of what an RFP looks like from a shipper's perspective of all the different cradle-to-grave items. If you want to show them how they can download that and take that away. Chris?
Right. We'll be sending out information about how people can get that download shortly.
Excellent. Yeah, and again, here's the slide on some of the products that Trimble has to allow a carrier and a shipper to engage in ways. So it's more of the the carrier side, to allow them to really understand their operation and give their operation visibility and that collaboration to a shipper on the Cubic side, or in general. Again, some great tools there.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Pete, Scott, and Stephanie. I think we all have a much better understanding of the bid season now, and I think our fears should be kind of allayed at least a little bit. We do have a little bit of time remaining. We have a lot of great questions that came in. I do want to remind everyone, if your question is not answered, don't be disappointed. The Trimble and Trimble team will be following up with you directly after the fact, and you may even see some of these, I think, as maybe even an FAQ that they may send out to the group today. So let's dive in and get some of those questions answered. So to start, I'm going to throw this out to the group. Maybe Pete, if you want to lead here. How would you begin with designing a network? You talked a lot about that in the presentation. So what would be your first 2 or 3 steps that you would recommend?
From a shipper's perspective, looking at my shipping network, I would look at all the facilities that I have in my company. Do I have a manufacturing facility, a distribution facility? What am I bringing into my facilities? Number one, that I'm paying for. Number two, where am I shipping to? Where are my large clients at? I want to be able to map out what my needs are for transportation coming into me for raw material that I'm paying for, what my outbound needs are to either distribution centers or to direct clients. So I can basically look at at my screen, get a visual of what my freight map looks like and where my dense lanes are. And I'd also put in there any nuances of any unique clients there too.
Okay, great. All right.
As a carrier, the way that I would approach it from a carrier perspective, and the way that we did approach it, is take your current book of business. You can't throw everything in the trash can and start over, right? You have a core that exists already. So take your current book of business, overlay that with any facility locations you have, terminals, drop yards, etc. Pull in your driver domicile, see where your drivers live currently, and then you're going to look at that and figure out your balance, eliminate the outliers. In fact, you may determine that you don't even have the right real estate footprint for your freight network and your driver domicile. So there's a lot of good things that can happen from this, but eliminate the outliers and then decide what you need. And then your sales team you'll create a critical lane needs list to fill in where you're a little light, and that's what they go out and sell, and that's what you approach through bids, and then probably focus on that for 6 months, and you will make improvements in your network design for sure.
Okay, great. And Stephanie, let's stick with you. Let's stick with you for a couple of minutes, and then Pete, maybe jump in from your perspective. What would you say is a fair number of bids to process per person?
We were joking today earlier with my team because we've all been here for a really long time. We remember when we used to get floppy disks in the mail from shippers.
Oh my gosh!
For a bid, and or just a really thick stack of pages that we have to go through. So I would say that the answer depends. It depends on what kind of business you're in. If you're an automotive carrier, then your net is the cast of your net is not as broad as, say, a general freight carrier. So that's going to make a difference. It's going to depend on your operating area, but it's also going to depend on your investment in technology because we have a lot of automation. I don't need a lot of people thinking through the hard things that computers can do. They can think through the things that people need to think through that computers can't possibly fathom, like how accounts make you feel and how drivers think about things and stuff like that. So it's really going to depend. I would say that in a moderate case, you have a little bit of technology to work with. I would say probably you could do with a person 5 bids a week.
Okay. And Pete, from your perspective, what do you say?
Yeah, I think Stephanie get that from a carrier perspective. I think from the shipper side, you're putting together not just one RFP. You should be thinking through sort of your annual sourcing strategy, with RFP being the big piece of it. The RFP might be an annual event, and it takes a lot of work, as we talked about earlier, to lead up to that, articulate all the goals and the scopes, and get carriers involved. But you may have subsequent RFPs or mini bids that fit a certain need. It might be once a quarter for new lanes that come up or service issues on lanes. Maybe you have, as new lanes come up, one-off lane bids. And that, you can manage your staff based on the size of your company and the lanes involved, so you're not always having this bid mentality, but always put someone with the bid. Spend time on implementing the bid properly and then managing your carrier's relationship so you're not having to be in the bid mode all the time. So I guess on the shipper side, it's more about seeing what you're willing to put into an annual effort to sourcing.
Okay, great. And now here's a question that I think really reflects maybe kind of where we are right now. And it's multi-part. I'm going to throw this out to the group, and whomever would like to jump in first, feel free, and we'll answer that. So the question here is, what is a carrier to do with the evolving contracted rates that have fallen below market rates, especially when shippers are asked for lower rates when the market shifted down? And it follows on with that. Why can't shippers bid every 2 years so carrier networks are not constantly upended? And is there any trend towards more flexible contracts that are attached to market conditions? So a lot there. I don't know if we're going to have time to get through every aspect of it, but maybe we can touch on at least one or two of those points.
I would say that what's a carrier to do with the evolving contracted rates that have fallen below market? I think we're talking about the extreme surge we've seen in spot market rates, and how do you allocate capacity according to that? Just, you have to have conversations with your customers. You have to go and talk to them. They know that there's this problem. They know they're competing against forces beyond all of our control. And just talk to them. As long as it's done in the correct way and everyone's professional, no one is going to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, but no, you're under a contract," especially because they see that your costs are increasing, your capacity is shrinking in many cases because of those costs and because of different options for drivers right now. So I would say speak up, have a frank conversation. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Exactly. Good advice. Good advice for sure. All right. Well, for our final question here, I think we have many other questions. Unfortunately, can't get to all of them, but I think this is a good one to end with. As a shipper and in this tight capacity market, how do I differentiate my company as a shipper of choice? So, I'll throw it to the group. Whoever wants to pick that up.
Yeah, I think with the shipper, being shipper of choice isn't about just what you put into bullet points. It's really about showing what the best quality of your company are, and have them in the whole shipping pattern. For example, people talk about driver-friendly freight. They talk about big open facilities, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's about, is the load ready on time? If they say 6 o'clock arrival time, do they really get you in and out of there in a prompt manner? Or are you waiting until 9, 10 o'clock in the morning to get you started? It's all about the actions of what the shipper does in his everyday business with you, not just the clean bathroom, not just the driver-friendly room. How quickly they work with you to get your equipment turned. So that's why the biggest thing the shipper is help the carrier get the equipment in and out of there, so they can get other, revenue on board.
It's a respect situation for me. It's respecting our investment in equipment. It's respecting our investment in the driver recruitment process, and to understand their role in helping the turnover equation. Because what shippers do, what the shippers we contract with, how they behave and how they load or don't load trucks reflects on us as a company. No one leaves a company because shipper ABC did something. They leave a company because that company did something and their customer is that company. So I want everyone to understand and respect each other's time and investment. And from that perspective, pay terms are important. The 180-day pay terms, that's quite a bit, but we see that. So, like Pete said, it goes beyond a clean bathroom. It goes to truly valuing the word partnership and not just using it as a word.
Yeah. I mean, kind of put your money where your mouth is, as it were.
Right.
All right. Well, great. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But as I mentioned earlier, for anyone who asked a question today that wasn't answered, and we have a lot of really great questions that I wish we could have had time to get to. We will be following up via email to answer your questions individually. And again, I think there might be sending some of those answers out to the group as well. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar. I want to again thank Pete, Scott, Stephanie, and the entire Trimble team for today's presentation. I also want to mention that this webinar will be available on demand on the Heavy Duty Trucking website at truckinginfo.com/webinars. Again, thanks for attending today's webinar, and I hope you all have a great day.